It's a pretty bad crisis. The BBC is now headless. It's been decapitated. The motive of some of the people, not all of the people, some of the people attacking the BBC, it has in the last week been completely hysterical. So they're seizing on this because they basically don't think the BBC should exist.
Because the BBC, rightly so, holds itself up to those very high editorial standards, it's all the more shocking when some of the issues in this Prescott letter are brought to the fore.
Hello and welcome to The Forecast. The BBC is in meltdown. Both the Director General and the Head of News have quit in the same weekend after a leaked memo accused the corporation of systemic political bias. The flashpoint was an edit of Donald Trump's speech ahead of the January 6th riots, and the president has now piled in, threatening $1 billion lawsuit. So what's really going on? Was this a right-wing coup against public service broadcasting, as some have suggested, or the consequence of genuine bias inside the BBC, or a bad mistake badly handled? And could this crisis now reshape the future of impartial news, not just at the BBC, but across British public service broadcasting? With me, the political editor of the Sunday Telegraph, Camilla Turner, and the editor of Prospect magazine, Alan Rusbridger. Alan, first of all, how big a crisis for the BBC is this?
It's a pretty bad crisis. The BBC is now headless. It's been decapitated at a time when it is coming into a very crucial period of renegotiating the charter. For some reason, the BBC charter has to be renewed every 10 years, unlike other royal charters. It's got to agree a funding formula for the future. And we're sort of 3.5 years off from a general election where a populist right could get in. And the lesson from around the world is populist right-wing governments tend to try and capture the media, and they certainly don't have much time for public service broadcasting.
But as more details come out, it does seem as though the BBC has shot itself in the foot pretty badly. This was an obvious mistake in the edits that was defended by BBC News executives months ago, only now for them to admit it was wrong.
You obviously know more than I do. It was a bad mistake. I don't know when it was first pointed out or to what extent it was defended by BBC executives. When the Telegraph came out with their story last week, it would have been better to admit that mistake, to correct it, and in my view, to put the Panorama programme back up. If you watch the rest of the Panorama programme, it's absolutely fine. Nothing wrong with it at all. But according to Nick Robinson today, the BBC board itself prevented the news executives from apologising in the way that they would have liked to.
So do you think there is something bigger going on about the structural governance and the people in power in the BBC and the pressures outside who are trying to bring it down?
Well, the BBC, it's a statement of fact to say that it's got many enemies. People on ideological or commercial grounds would gladly see it dead, and that includes Rupert Murdoch and his newspaper stable. The governance of the BBC, it sounds very nerdy, but you have to get into it. It's got a board of directors, 5 of whom are appointed by the government, including the chair. When I looked at the board most recently, I could only find 3 people who'd ever had a recent experience of practice in journalism, and that makes a little committee, the editorial standards and guidelines committee, a very powerful committee, and that, to my mind, is a complete mess. It's got 5 people on it, 3 of whom are insiders, 2 of whom are outsiders. Of the outsiders, until recently, only one had any experience of journalism, and that was a political appointee. It was Sir Robbie Gibb. He doesn't make any pretense at impartiality. He was, until fairly recently, a Conservative Party spin doctor. And so the BBC's got itself into this extraordinary position, one of the great news organizations in the world, of having this tiny little committee in which there was, until recently, only one independent arbiter. And we're expected to take his word as gospel as to what constitutes impartiality or bias.
Robbie Gibb says that he was impartial when he was a BBC producer, then he went into politics, and now his job at the BBC is again to defend impartiality. you saying that's not really possible?
Well, he would say that. I note that when he tried to stop someone else getting a job in the BBC News department, he wasn't prepared to give them the benefit of the doubt that they, like him, could apparently put their views, leave them at the door. The trouble about these arguments about impartiality is right-wing people tend to think the BBC is too left-wing. Lots of left-wing people think the BBC is too right-wing. And that extends to Israel, trans issues, etc., etc. And it's rather fruitless to have a lot of people chipping in, saying that in their view, the BBC is biased. I would include Sir Robbie Gibb in that. The one body that is charged officially with deciding whether the BBC is impartial or not is Ofcom. And if you go back and read their reports, as I have done over the years, I think I'm right in saying, I'm not sure I've read the most recent one, in every year they've given the BBC a pretty clean bill of health in terms of impartiality.
Camilla, let me bring you in. I mean, isn't the Telegraph jumping quite a way, going from an obvious error of editing in that panorama to accusations of institutional bias?
Well, I think the revelations we had from the Telegraph, starting off last week with that Panorama documentary, the editing of Trump's speech, and then going onto the other days of last week, we also touched on the issues that the BBC board had been made aware of to do with BBC Arabic, to do with reporting of trans issues, to do with reporting of the Israel-Gaza war. So
these are all just opinions. They're not, I mean, they happen to be Michael Prescott's opinions of those things. They're not open and shut in the way that the Panorama is.
Opinions were very much backed up by facts that he cites in his letter. He talks about these contributors who had been invited onto BBC Arabic dozens and dozens of times, despite expressing very, in some cases, outwardly anti-Semitic views, praising October the 7th. These are the sorts of contributors that any media organisation might think twice before inviting onto their shows, let alone the BBC, which we are told holds up the highest possible standards in its reporting. So I think the reason why we've ended this week with Tim Davie himself resigning, as well as the BBC's head of news, is just because these issues in the leaked letter were quite so serious. Had it just been someone's opinion or something that was kind of arguable either way, we probably wouldn't be in the situation we are now, with the BBC in complete crisis and its top executives resigning over it.
Well, I mean, in fact, the BBC chairman has said that there was nothing in the Prescott letter that was telling them anything new, and that the only issue that they've really capitulated on is the editing of that one clip in Panorama. All those other things were issues that the BBC was looking into, and they disagree or agree with the broad criticism to differing levels. I mean, what I'm saying is we've gone from a mistake to a vast accusation against a whole organisation employing more than 20,000 people, tarring them with this claim of institutional bias. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think the institutional bias is something for the BBC to look at itself, really.
But what is it?
I think well, if you look at the certain areas that the Prescott letter touched on, there was the Trump documentary and reporting around Trump. There was the Israel-Gaza war. There was BBC Arabic. There was reporting around trans issues. These are quite a few different controversial areas, of course, for any media organisation to be reporting on. But for the BBC to get things right and to report without fear or favour, to report without bias, to report in a way that doesn't seem like they've been captured by any one side or other, is just of the utmost importance. And I think it's because the BBC, rightly so, holds itself up to those very high editorial standards. It's all the more shocking when some of the issues in this Prescott letter are brought to the fore. And I think also the fact that this letter had gone to the BBC Trust many months ago, and the reason for its leak was because it was felt that none of these issues had been properly addressed. Nothing had been done about the documentary, and none of these issues had been addressed in a way that those who were upset about them felt was satisfactory. And I think the reason why we've ended this week with Trump threatening to sue the BBC, with Tim Davie's resignation, is not only the BBC's handling of these issues, but because these issues go to the very core of what the BBC should be doing. And I think it's right that they are looked at properly, and that the BBC looks itself at whether there are broader institutional problems that need to be addressed here.
Alan, how do you get to a point of impartiality in a world where, people in Camilla's organisation accuse the BBC of anti-right-wing bias and anti-Israel bias and anti-Trump bias, and people on the left, as you say, accuse the BBC of being too pro-Israel, too pro-conservative, of giving Nigel Farage too much airtime? I mean, is there such a thing now as impartiality that everyone would recognise?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I don't know what the answer is. I don't know what body you could have that would satisfy everybody that the BBC is always going to be straight down the middle on everything. On Israel, Gaza, there was a report about 2 or 3 months ago from a perfectly respectable monitoring group that claimed the BBC was biased towards Israel. That didn't get much airtime because it goes against the conventional narrative of the BBC. So again, it slightly depends where you're starting with. I just think the BBC's governance arrangements, if you've got a board of governors who are mainly business leaders, hedge fund managers, private equity people, and so forth, and somebody has got to reach decisions about whether the BBC is meeting its own standards. The current arrangements aren't very good for that. I think in days past there was a board full of people imbued in BBC values who could take reasoned decisions on that. And I go back to the problem that if you've got a tiny committee with a government appointee on it who is clearly making a lot of the running in all this, then that seems to be a suboptimal way of deciding anything to do with these highly contentious issues.
So you think we need to go into a whole new review of how the BBC is governed?
I think that should be on the list of things that should be sorted out. I think it's common ground between all sides, both the attackers and the defenders of the BBC, that things aren't working very well at the moment, and that would be my two pennyworth. That anybody coming to do that job, brackets, who on earth is this person that is? I think it has to be a journalist. I think Tim Davie was at a disadvantage because he didn't have a journalistic background. But who is this tough, impartial journalist with a real spine who can also simultaneously run a £6 billion corporation? And who's going to have their back? And if if when they turn around and look at the board, and the board is arguing about whether they're free to issue the kind of defence they want to issue, then it's a very unsatisfactory position all round.
Camilla, it's obviously in the Telegraph's commercial interest that the BBC be diminished, and other commercial news websites like yours, because you will benefit. Is that part of the story here? How upfront is the Telegraph about what it really wants for the BBC?
I'm not sure. That's interesting point. I'm not sure how much that plays into things, because what people come to the BBC for is, of course, it's news, but there are things the BBC can't really do, like opinion and kind of op-eds and commentary, which is, it does kind of occupy a slightly different space. Obviously, the BBC is a broadcaster, the Telegraph is a newspaper. So I'm not sure how much our audiences are directly in conflict. We do both provide the news, that is correct. But I think this story isn't really about one media organisation trying to criticise another. It's much bigger than that. The BBC is our public service broadcaster here in the UK. It's taxpayer funded. Everyone who pays their licence fee, it goes to the BBC. I think what this Prescott letter has showed us is that there are certain instances in certain areas where there are serious concerns that have been brought to the BBC's board and felt by some to have not been properly addressed and therefore put out into the public domain. I don't think this is a kind of intra-media discussion here. It's about what license fee payers should expect from the BBC and what the public should expect from the BBC. And I think if it's falling short of that, there are questions to be answered.
But do you accept that everybody needs to feel that the BBC is fair, not just Telegraph readers? So Guardian readers and trans activists and Green voters and and Reform voters, and everybody needs to have some level of trust in that broadcaster, and that's a pretty tall order right now.
Absolutely, and there's criticism of the BBC from all quarters, from the right, from the left. I listened to Sonia Soda earlier this week or on the weekend, a prominent journalist from the left talking about her issues with the BBC's coverage of trans reporting. These are complex issues that are difficult to get right, but that doesn't mean that the BBC shouldn't be held up to those very high standards that the public and the license fee payers should expect. And yes, of course, there are differences of opinions on how to go about reporting these things from across the political spectrum. But I think that's not really an excuse to not get it right.
Right, but how much of a tragedy do you think it would be if the BBC was sort of fatally damaged?
I think the BBC is a hugely important organisation. It's part of our kind of national public life. It's got a deep history. It does really important work. I'm a huge fan. I listen to Radio 4 all the time. I watch a lot of its programmes. I think it has a really important part to play in public life. But I think it does need to get things right. And when serious concerns are raised about its coverage that aren't just a one-off, these are concerns that have been going on for quite some time and aired in different areas. This Prescott letter, I think, brings them to the fore in quite a shocking way. And I think that's why it's had the impact that it has with Tim Davie's resignation, with Trump threatening to sue the BBC. It's having a big ripple effect now, but that's because these aren't just issues that are in isolation. This isn't the first time we've heard of them. These are ongoing concerns people have around the BBC's coverage in certain areas. And I think it's in the BBC's interest to get it right. People do respect the BBC and listen to them and think of them as a kind of beacon of high quality journalism. And so it's all the more important that when they are criticised, they address it head on and try to do their best to look at where they can do things differently. I mean,
Alan, one of the BBC's biggest and consistent problems is the way it handles problems and complaints, in that it is always very slow. It tends to kick things into the long grass and have reviews and hope that things will go away. I think somebody called it sort of playing dead when there's a problem. I mean, is that one of the reasons they got into this mess?
Well, it clearly hasn't been brilliant in the last week. I agree with that. I think that's a little unfair. The BBC knows that it's under huge scrutiny all the time. And we can all think of many times where the BBC has been placed under the spotlight, sometimes a judicial or quasi-judicial spotlight. And the BBC, I think, is far more transparent in its operations than many of its critics are. So, but it clearly hasn't handled this one well. I mean, I think the problem with some of the criticism, clearly there were some concrete things that Michael Prescott raised. Samir Shah says that some of those have already been addressed, so that they're slightly historic. But you can tell the motive of some of the people, not all of the people, some of the people attacking the BBC, has in the last week been completely hysterical. So they're seizing on this because they basically don't think the BBC should exist. And so some of the criticism and commentary is just nakedly people opportunistically trying to attack an organization that, if we did have a sense of proportion, we would have to acknowledge is easily the most trusted, by huge margin, the most trusted, certainly against newspapers, news provider in this country. a big piece in Columbia Journalism Review that came out only about a week ago, saying that it's now the second most trusted news organization in the US, behind the Weather Channel, believe it or not. So nobody should be citing Donald Trump and his attack on the BBC as evidence that anything is wrong in the BBC. Of course, Donald Trump, whenever he sees a credible news organization, he tries to discredit it, sue it, pursue it, and generally rubbish it. So Donald Trump trying to take revenge against the BBC, however justified in terms of the mistake, should count for nothing, as should his press secretary telling Brits that they should be watching GB News rather than the BBC. This stuff is laughable.
Right, but I mean, the Trump threat does change things, doesn't it? In that, I mean, first of all, if the BBC is pushed into settling the way a lot of American channels have with Donald Trump, this is license fee payers' money, and it could be tens of millions of pounds. But also, in order to settle, the admissions that the Trump team seem to be demanding in their initial letter to the BBC go way beyond what the BBC could possibly admit, because the Trump team are alleging this is sort of deliberate defamation, deliberate misrepresentation, when the BBC's position is it was a mistake.
Well, they shouldn't settle. We've seen Trump suing the New York Times, one of the greatest news organizations in the world. He's suing the Wall Street Journal for $1 billion. He's sued ABC. He's sued CBS. He's even suing the Pulitzer Prize Committee for giving a Pulitzer Prize to someone he doesn't like. I mean, this is vexatious nonsense, and the BBC should stand firm. There's a doctrine in America called New York Times versus Sullivan, which holds that if you're criticizing or writing about a public figure, unless you can show actual malice, those are the words, actual malice, then you have a complete defense. And even this Supreme Court has not overturned that. So I very much hope the BBC will say this was an honest error. There's no evidence of actual malice. And they could take the lead in showing some spine in taking on this Donald Trump assault on the press, which none of us, from the Telegraph to the Guardian to whoever, to Channel 4 News, should welcome.
Camilla, what do you think about that?
Well, I think obviously it is a difficult position to put the BBC into, and as Alan Rossbridger just said, Donald Trump does have form of suing or threatening to sue media organizations in the past when they've sort of rubbed him up the wrong way for whatever reason. I mean, I think if we just go back to journalistic basics here on that Panorama documentary in particular, clearly editing or splicing someone's remarks such that the meaning is materially different from what they meant to say had the full quotation been included, that is, that there is a case to answer for that kind of editing and that kind of selective quoting. And I think on that point particularly, it's a difficult defense from the BBC. They might say, yes, this was a mistake, but then why didn't they correct it when Prescott first drew it to the attention of the board?
Sure,
so
the question is sort of what happens in law, though, isn't it? I mean, if of course, Trump isn't attempting to sue in Britain. He's attempting to sue in America. And the sort of the pattern when he's suing American channels is that the threat of tying them up in legal knots and wasting millions of dollars in legal fees and the threat of disclosure of documents means that they end up settling. The BBC could be pushed into that here as well. I mean, you don't want to see license payers' money, surely, going to Donald Trump and his lawyers.
But this is the glory of the BBC. And you're making the case for the BBC here, because the reason that these organizations have tended to settle with Trump is because the owners need favors from Trump. It's usually because they are trying to take over another media corporation, or they want a favor in terms of mergers and acquisitions. The BBC has no dog in any of those races. It's owned by a public institution. It has no reason to settle. And as I've tried to explain, the New York Times versus Sullivan doctrine is exactly meant for this situation. I mean, what turned on this editing? Clearly, the editing was a mistake, but I don't think, surely no one is making the case that Donald Trump wasn't inciting the crowd on that January the 6th, because then we're rewriting the whole of history. The congressional hearing that looked into that decided that he was. The Senate decided, with 7 Republicans voting with the Democrats, that he was. The only court that has come to a ruling on it decided that he was. So yes, it was a bad and stupid error and has opened up the BBC to attack. But I think Donald Trump would have a job persuading people that he was completely innocent in what he did on January the 6th.
Yes, I mean, Camilla, the Congressional Committee, after all, I don't think it concluded on the word incite, but it did say, or aiding or abetting what happened, and it was a pretty conclusive result.
Yes, that's right. And I think it just comes back to that issue of, you write an article and then your top line gets kind of ramped up by the editor to a point that it doesn't really make sense anymore. And you say, we don't need to, make this more extreme than it already is. It's already shocking. You don't need to make an edit to make it kind of worse than it is. If you look at the basic error made in that Panorama documentary, it was just a bad edit, and it's quite hard to argue anything else.
Camilla, what do you want for the future of the BBC?
I think what I want, and what any kind of license fee payer, taxpayer would want, is a BBC that is able to uphold the best possible editorial standards to report on what are difficult issues, but without being biased in one way or another, and to have a news operation that functions in a way that where kind of clear standards are set for journalists to follow, so that the public and the viewers are watching or reading or listening to the BBC's output in a way that they can rightly feel confident that they're getting the best possible information in a just kind of straight down the road sort of way, with no kind of interest group or no worry that it's been captured by one side or another, just that it's good, impartial reporting, which is, I think, what everyone would expect to see.
Yeah, and do you acknowledge Alan's earlier point that the BBC is the most trusted broadcaster?
Yeah, I mean, if that's what the sort of surveys and reviews are saying, then
yeah. I mean, there are 2 notable surveys that go on most years, done by Ofcom and the Reuters Institute, and they generally put the BBC out there at the top, and Channel 4 is usually very closely behind, and we argue over whether we are most trusted or they are most trusted, because they have slightly more people who distrust them, and we have fewer. But I think that's what the numbers say.
I think it's great that the UK has this incredible tradition of public service broadcasting, that not just in the UK, but I think around the world, people look to the UK as having good sources of information that can be trusted. If you compare us to other countries around the world where there's much more state interference of media, we're incredibly lucky to live in a country where we have really strong traditions of both broadcasting and print journalism that can really report properly and hold the government to account. But I think, given the BBC's particular setup, that it's anyone who wants to watch television has to pay the BBC license fee, I think when there are questions over its impartiality, I think it needs to look at these very carefully, not just kind of hide under the table, pretend it's not happening, ignore concerns. They need to address these head on, because it's great that it's so trusted, and it needs to continually, every day, earn that trust and make sure it's doing the best job it possibly can.
We'll leave it there. Thank you very much indeed. Camilla Turner, Alan Rusbridger, thank you both very much for joining us on The Forecast. Well, that's it for today. The story is going to rumble on over the next few days, and we'll see what else comes out. But for now, bye-bye.